At its core, postmodernism questions whether any single perspective can capture reality completely. It examines how language, power structures, and cultural systems shape what we consider knowledge. These ideas did not appear from nowhere. They emerged from specific historical conditions after World War II. The horrors of the war, technological changes, and communication revolution created conditions for radical rethinking. Thinkers witnessed how scientific rationality produced death camps and atomic weapons. They saw mass media reshape human perception and experience fundamentally. Postmodernism challenged the Enlightenment's core promise that reason would lead to universal progress and human liberation. Instead, postmodern thinkers argued that grand narratives about history, progress, and truth often serve power rather than liberation. They showed how knowledge systems exclude certain voices while privileging others. They revealed how categories we assume are natural are actually historical constructions. Understanding postmodernism requires grasping both its philosophical arguments and its historical emergence. It demands examining how ideas intersect with social practices, institutions, and power relations. Part 1. Intellectual Precursors and Historical Foundations. Postmodernism did not emerge spontaneously, but grew from specific philosophical roots and historical transformations. Understanding these foundations reveals the deeper logic behind postmodern claims. The philosophical groundwork begins with Immanuel Kant's revolutionary insight in the late 18th century. Kant argued we cannot know things as they exist independently of our minds. Instead, objects of knowledge must conform to our faculties of representation. Our minds actively structure experience rather than passively receiving reality. This means we never access reality directly, but only through conceptual frameworks. Kant believed these frameworks were universal and necessary for all rational beings. But this opened a question that would haunt Western philosophy. If knowledge depends on our conceptual apparatus, how can we guarantee its objectivity? Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel pushed this insight further in the early 19th century. He argued that even immediate sense experience involves mediation through concepts and language. When we perceive something as existing here and now, we use concepts like this and now. These concepts are not immediately sensed, but are products of thought. This means consciousness cannot find any completely immediate foundation for knowledge. Everything we know is mediated through conceptual structures that develop historically. Hegel proposed that this development follows a dialectical logic toward absolute knowledge. But later, thinkers questioned whether such absolute knowledge was achievable or even desirable. The late 19th century brought what postmodernists call achieved modernity. Science and technology, including mass communication and transportation networks, fundamentally reshaped human perception. The natural and the artificial became increasingly difficult to distinguish in experience. This technological transformation had profound effects on human subjectivity and reality itself. Postmodernists identify this as derealization, where subjects and objects lose their sense of stable identity. Things that once seemed solid and constant became fluid and uncertain. Three 19th century thinkers provided crucial concepts for postmodernism: Søren Kierkegaard described how modern society creates an abstract phantom called the public. The press creates this mass of unreal individuals who never unite in actual situations. Society becomes a realization of abstract thought held together by artificial media speaking for everyone and no one. This anticipates postmodern concerns about how media and representation shape contemporary experience. Karl Marx analyzed how commodities under capitalism lose their solidity as use values. They become spectral figures under the aspect of exchange value. Their ghostly nature results from absorption into networks of social relations. Their values fluctuate independently of their physical being. Human subjects experience this derealization because commodities are products of their labor. Workers paradoxically lose their being in realizing themselves through production. This analysis of how economic systems transform reality profoundly influenced postmodern thought. Friedrich Nietzsche provided the most direct philosophical foundation for postmodernism. He described being as the last breath of a vaporizing reality. He traced how Western philosophy distinguished a true world from an apparent world. From Plato through Christianity to modern philosophy, this distinction structured Western thought. But Nietzsche argued this true world eventually becomes a useless and superfluous idea. Once we eliminate the notion of a true world, we also eliminate the apparent world. What remains is neither real nor apparent, but something in between. This collapse of traditional metaphysical distinctions opens space for postmodern thinking. Nietzsche's genealogical method became central to postmodernism. Instead of seeking origins as fixed foundations, genealogy studies accidents and contingencies that converge at crucial moments. This method exposes how concepts we assume are natural actually have contingent histories. The concept of the I, or self, provides a key example. Nietzsche argued this concept arose from moral imperatives to be responsible for actions. To be responsible, we must assume we cause our actions as identical subjects persisting over time. The I becomes a social construction and moral illusion rather than a metaphysical truth. This genealogical approach reveals how power relations and social needs generate concepts that present themselves as necessary truths. Nietzsche also proposed that scientific concepts are chains of metaphors hardened into accepted truths. A nerve stimulus gets copied as an image, then imitated in sound, becoming a word that becomes a concept. Concepts arise through equating unequal things, forgetting the metaphorical leap between levels. This means truth is not discovered, but constructed through linguistic and social processes. Language shapes what counts as knowledge, rather than transparently representing reality. The concept of eternal return takes on new meaning in postmodern interpretation. Rather than identical repetition of everything, postmodernists read this as repetition of difference itself. Each moment is new and different, yet this newness eternally repeats as the structure of time. Nothing is simply identical to itself or to what came before. This interpretation challenges traditional metaphysics built on identity and presence. It suggests reality is fundamentally characterized by difference, change, and becoming rather than stable being. Martin Heidegger provided another crucial influence, despite later postmodernist disagreements with him. Heidegger argued that Western metaphysics conceives being as the presence of beings. In the modern world, presence means availability of beings for use. Technology reduces entities to calculable resources in what Heidegger called the enframing. The mountain becomes a standing supply of coal. The river becomes an engine for hydroelectric energy. Humans themselves become reserves of manpower in this technological framework. The experience of modernity is the experience of being's withdrawal in face of technological enframing. Heidegger also challenged the concept of the subject as conscious identity or ground. He reconceived the human being as Dasein, an event of ecstatic temporality. Dasein is open to a past that was never present and a future that is always yet to come. This temporal structure cannot be contained within consciousness or within traditional notions of subjectivity. The subject is not a fixed foundation, but a temporal unfolding characterized by finitude and incompleteness. Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic theory added another dimension to critiques of the subject. Lacan insisted the Freudian unconscious functions through language rather than biological drives. The subject is always the subject of speech directed toward another who mediates self-identity. Language belongs to the symbolic order of society, constituted as an economy of signifiers. Through language, animal need becomes human desire, whose first object is recognition by the other. But desire ultimately aims for something impossible, to possess or be the phallus as the signifier of signifiers. Since the phallus signifies the signifying function itself, it does not exist as a possessible object. This imposes a fundamental absence or lack that divides the subject from itself permanently. The subject remains perpetually incomplete, unable to achieve final unity or identity. These intellectual precursors established several key themes that postmodernism would develop. First, knowledge and subjectivity cannot be understood as immediate or natural, but are mediated through historical and linguistic structures. Second, what appears natural or necessary often has contingent historical origins shaped by power relations. Third, technological and economic transformations fundamentally alter human experience and subjectivity. Fourth, traditional metaphysical concepts like identity, presence and truth require critical examination. Fifth, language does not transparently represent reality, but actively shapes what counts as real. The historical context of postmodernism's emergence is equally crucial. World War II and its aftermath created conditions for radical rethinking of Enlightenment assumptions. The Nazis used scientific rationality and bureaucratic efficiency to organize genocide. Nuclear weapons demonstrated how scientific progress could threaten human existence itself. These events shattered confidence that reason naturally leads to human liberation. They showed how rationality could serve domination and destruction as easily as freedom. The post-war period saw rapid technological development, especially in communication and information systems. Television, computers, and mass media transformed how people experienced reality. Information became increasingly important as both economic resource and form of social control. Knowledge production shifted from pursuit of truth to optimization of performance and efficiency. Universities and research institutions became increasingly tied to corporate and state interests. This raised questions about whether knowledge could maintain independence from power structures. The events of May 1968 in Paris provided a watershed moment for postmodern thought. Student uprisings and worker strikes challenged established institutions and authority structures. Traditional Marxist parties and unions seemed unable to comprehend or effectively respond to these movements. The protests revealed limitations in existing frameworks for understanding power, resistance, and social change. They suggested power operated through diffuse networks rather than concentrated in state or economic institutions alone. This experience shaped postmodern emphasis on local struggles, heterogeneous movements, and multiple forms of resistance. The structuralist revolution in 1950s and early 1960s Paris provided immediate intellectual context. Structuralism, drawing from linguistics, analyzed cultural phenomena as systems of signs following formal rules. It emphasized how meaning arises from differences within systems rather than from reference to external reality. But structuralism treated these systems as static and ahistorical. Post-structuralism, the term often used interchangeably with postmodernism, challenged this static conception. It emphasized how structures change, how they contain contradictions, and how they relate to power and history. Where structuralism sought scientific objectivity, post-structuralism questioned whether such objectivity was possible or desirable. Part 2. Lyotard and the Collapse of Grand Narratives. Jean-François Lyotard introduced the term postmodern into philosophical discourse with his 1979 work, The Postmodern Condition. This book, originally commissioned as a report on knowledge in computerized societies, became foundational for understanding postmodernism. Lyotard defined postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. This deceptively simple definition carries profound implications for how we understand knowledge, legitimation, and social organization. Meta-narratives are overarching stories that claim to explain history, progress, and the goals of humanity. They function to legitimate various forms of knowledge and social practices. Two principal meta-narratives dominated modernity according to Lyotard. The first, rooted in Hegel, presents history as progressing toward totality and unity of all knowledge. Scientific advancement becomes legitimate because it supposedly leads toward this ultimate goal of complete understanding. The second, rooted in Marx, gives science a role in the emancipation of humanity from oppression. Knowledge production serves the grand project of human liberation and social progress. Both narratives claim universal validity and present themselves as objective descriptions of historical reality. Lyotard argued these meta-narratives have lost credibility in postmodern conditions. But we must understand why this collapse occurred rather than simply asserting it happened. Technological and social transformations since World War II fundamentally altered the nature and status of knowledge. The computerization of society changed not just how knowledge is transmitted, but what knowledge is. Information replaced understanding as the primary form of knowledge. Knowledge became data-coded within systems of transmission and communication. This transformation connects directly to economic changes. Knowledge entered the economic equation during the Industrial Revolution as a force for production. But in postmodernity, knowledge becomes the central force for production itself. Universities and research institutions increasingly serve corporate and state interests rather than pursuing knowledge for its own sake. Research gets funded based on potential applications and economic returns. The question shifts from "is this true" to "is this useful?" Is this efficient? Does this increase productivity? Lyotard called this new criterion for legitimating knowledge performativity. Performativity means maximizing input-output ratios, optimizing efficiency in the knowledge-producing system. What matters is not whether knowledge is true or contributes to human understanding. What matters is whether it improves technical performance and produces measurable results. This performative criterion threatens anything that cannot demonstrate efficiency. Speculative narratives, humanistic inquiry, and critical thought become delegitimized because they do not optimize performance. But performativity contains an internal contradiction. Capital demands continual reinvention of the new to maintain competitive advantage and expand markets. This requires creativity, innovation, and experimentation that cannot be optimized through efficiency alone. Science, in its inventive moments, does not adhere to performative efficiency, but engages in unpredictable exploration. The rules of science themselves become objects of invention and experimentation. This means the system requires what Lyotard calls paralogy, productive deviation from established norms. The collapse of meta-narratives creates a situation of radical pluralism. Knowledge fragments into heterogeneous language games without overarching unity. Lyotard borrowed this concept of language games from Ludwig Wittgenstein. Different domains of knowledge and practice operate according to different rules and criteria. Scientific statements follow different rules than moral prescriptions. Aesthetic judgments follow different rules than technical instructions. No single meta-language can encompass all these heterogeneous games. No universal criteria can judge all forms of knowledge from a neutral standpoint. This plurality raises fundamental questions about justice and legitimation. Without meta-narratives, how do we decide between competing claims and values? Lyotard addressed this in subsequent works, particularly the differend. A differend occurs when a conflict between parties cannot be resolved because they operate within incommensurable language games. One party's suffering cannot be phrased in terms the other party recognizes as legitimate. The wrong cannot even be properly expressed within the dominant discourse. Lyotard turned to Kant's aesthetic judgment as a model for postmodern justice. Aesthetic judgment must be reflective rather than determining, because it lacks concepts to subsume particulars. We judge without rules, responding to singularities that resist universal categories. This requires moving among different language games without claiming mastery over them. Justice becomes less about applying universal rules and more about attending to differences and incommensurabilities. It involves recognizing when one language game silences or excludes others. Lyotard emphasized the sublime rather than the beautiful in aesthetic experience. The sublime occurs when we are overwhelmed by something unpresentable, something exceeding our capacities. For Kant, this reveals reason's power to conceive ideas surpassing sensible experience. But for Lyotard, the postmodern sublime occurs without reference to reason as unifying origin. We are affected by multiple unpresentables without any framework to organize them. This describes the postmodern condition more accurately than classical aesthetic harmony. Lyotard distinguished modern art from postmodern art in terms of how they address the unpresentable. Modern art presents the unpresentable as missing content within beautiful form. Think of Marcel Proust's writings searching for lost time through elegant prose. Postmodern art, exemplified by James Joyce, puts forward the unpresentable by abandoning beautiful form itself. It denies consensus of taste and refuses to provide aesthetic comfort. Joyce's Finnegans. Wake deliberately frustrates conventional reading expectations. Critically, Lyotard argued that postmodern does not simply follow modern chronologically. Rather, the postmodern is the modern in its nascent state. Every work becomes modern only by first being postmodern. The postmodern is the moment when art attempts to present the unpresentable, creating the demand for another repetition. This state is constant, not a historical period that ends. Postmodernism names an attitude toward innovation and the new, rather than a historical epoch. The political implications of Lyotard's analysis are significant. Without meta-narratives to legitimate social arrangements, we face a danger that performativity becomes the sole criterion. This would mean social organization based purely on technical efficiency and capital accumulation. Human values become subordinated to system optimization. But the plurality of language games also offers possibilities for resistance. Multiple local narratives compete and coexist without any single framework dominating completely. Lyotard rejected the idea that intersubjective communication aims at consensus. Jürgen Habermas argued that communication presupposes shared rules and seeks agreement. But Lyotard insisted that dissensus and conflict are irreducible features of social life. Different language games generate incommensurable positions that cannot be reconciled through dialogue alone. The goal should not be forcing consensus, but maintaining spaces where different games can operate. This requires vigilance against totalizing discourses that silence alternative voices. Critics challenged Lyotard's thesis on several grounds. Some argued that science does not actually rely on grand narratives for legitimation. Science proceeds through accumulation of many smaller successes rather than one overarching story. Others pointed out that meta-narratives continue to play major roles in contemporary society. Liberalism, various forms of nationalism, religious narratives, and even some interpretations of globalization function as grand narratives. The reports of meta-narratives' death may have been greatly exaggerated. Lyotard himself later expressed reservations about the postmodern condition. He admitted having limited knowledge of the science he discussed. He called it simply the worst of all his books. But this self-criticism does not negate the work's significance for opening debates about knowledge, legitimation, and social change. The concept of incredulity toward meta-narratives captures something essential about contemporary experience. People increasingly question universal claims and recognize multiple perspectives. However, whether this represents genuine historical transformation or merely intellectual fashion remains contested. Some argue Lyotard described an elite academic position rather than broad social reality. Others insist the computerization and marketization of knowledge genuinely transformed epistemological conditions. Lyotard's analysis connects to broader concerns about expertise, authority, and democratic legitimacy. If knowledge becomes primarily a commodity optimized for performance, what happens to critical inquiry? If efficiency replaces truth as the primary value, how do we resist instrumentalization of thought? If no narrative can claim universal validity, how do we build solidarity across differences? These questions remain urgently relevant in contemporary debates about post-truth politics, algorithmic governance, and information economies. Part 3. Derrida and Deconstruction. Jacques Derrida introduced deconstruction as a radical approach to reading and understanding texts. In 1967, at age 37, Derrida published 3 books simultaneously that transformed continental philosophy. These works of grammatology, writing and difference, and speech and phenomena established deconstruction as a major intellectual movement. But deconstruction resists simple definition precisely because it questions the stability of definitions themselves. Deconstruction begins with close attention to how texts construct meaning through oppositions and hierarchies. Western philosophy relies heavily on binary oppositions like presence and absence, speech and writing, nature and culture. In each pair, one term gets privileged as primary, original, or superior. The other term becomes secondary, derivative, or inferior. Derrida showed how these hierarchies are not natural or necessary, but constructed and maintained through specific operations. More importantly, he demonstrated that the privileged term actually depends on what it excludes. Consider the opposition between speech and writing in Western philosophy. From Plato through Rousseau to modern linguistics, speech has been privileged as primary language. Speech supposedly provides immediate access to meaning because the speaker is present. Writing becomes merely a secondary representation of speech, functioning in the speaker's absence. This prejudice assumes meaning originates in consciousness and gets expressed directly through voice. Writing appears as a dangerous supplement that can distort or corrupt original meaning. Derrida called this privileging of speech logocentrism. Logos refers to speech, thought, reason, and law in Greek philosophy. Logocentrism assumes that speech brings us closer to truth than writing does. It imagines consciousness can be transparently present to itself in the moment of speaking. This connects to what Derrida called the metaphysics of presence. Western philosophy seeks immediate access to meaning, privileging presence over absence, fullness over lack. But Derrida argued this hierarchy cannot be maintained. Even speech involves differences, gaps, and absences that supposedly characterize only writing. When I speak, I must differentiate one sound from another for words to have meaning. Meaning depends on differences within a system rather than positive content in individual signs. The word cat means what it does because it differs from bat, hat, cut and car. No word contains its meaning within itself as a present fullness. Furthermore, for sounds to function as language, they must be repeatable across different contexts. This repeatability introduces what Derrida called iterability, the structural possibility of repetition. But each repetition occurs in a new context that shifts meaning. The same words mean differently when spoken by different people in different situations. This means no sign can ever be fully present to itself with fixed meaning. Meaning is always deferred, always depends on absent contexts and future interpretations. Derrida introduced the term difference to capture this complex structure. Difference deliberately misspells the French word difference with an A instead of an E. In spoken French, these sound identical, so the difference appears only in writing. This challenges the primacy of speech by showing that writing can make distinctions that speech cannot. Difference combines two French verbs, to differ and to defer. It names the process by which signs differ from each other and defer meaning across time. Difference is not itself a concept or a word in the traditional sense. It names the spacing and deferral that makes concepts and words possible. It is the play of differences that generates meaning without ever being fully present itself. Derrida wrote that difference is literally neither a word nor a concept. It marks something more originary than presence and absence, something prior to metaphysical distinctions. This is why Derrida said difference is older than being itself, older than the ontological difference Heidegger emphasized. Deconstruction does not simply reverse hierarchies by privileging writing over speech. Such reversal would remain within the same metaphysical framework it aims to question. Instead, deconstruction traces how texts simultaneously construct and undermine their own hierarchies. It shows where texts contradict themselves, where arguments depend on what they explicitly reject. Every text contains resources for reading against itself, for exposing gaps between what it says and what it does. Derrida emphasized that deconstruction is not destruction. It does not tear down texts or reject meaning entirely. Deconstruction works from within texts, using their own terms and logic to reveal internal tensions. It shows how meaning is more complex, unstable, and productive than traditional interpretation assumes. The goal is not to dismiss texts, but to read them more carefully than they read themselves. Consider how deconstruction approaches the concept of the supplement. Rousseau used supplement to mean an inessential addition to something already complete. But Derrida showed that supplements only add to things that were incomplete to begin with. If something truly complete receives an addition, this proves it was not complete after all. The supplement thus reveals an originary lack in what presents itself as self-sufficient. Nature supposedly needs culture as a supplement, but this shows nature was never purely natural. The trace is another key concept in Derrida's vocabulary. Every sign carries traces of what it differs from, of absent contexts and possible meanings. The trace is not a present thing, but the mark of absence within presence. It names how every element refers to something outside itself that it is not. Language operates through this play of traces rather than through present meanings. The trace undermines any philosophy based on full presence or self-identity. Derrida's famous claim that there is no outside text has been widely misunderstood. This does not mean reality does not exist, or that everything is just words on a page. Rather, it means every referent, all reality, has the structure of a differential trace. We never access reality except through interpretive frameworks, linguistic structures, and conceptual schemes. This does not make reality illusory, but shows that the distinction between inside and outside text is itself a textual effect. Texts include the contexts, histories, and material conditions of their production and reception. Binary oppositions structure Western metaphysics according to Derrida. Presence and absence, identity and difference, speech and writing, nature and culture, reason and madness, man and woman. In each case, the first term is valorized as original, primary, and superior. The second term becomes derivative, secondary, and inferior. But deconstruction shows these oppositions are not given in nature. They are constructed through specific conceptual work that can be analyzed and questioned. Importantly, Derrida argued we cannot simply step outside these oppositions. We must work within them, using their terms while showing their instability. This is why Derrida called his terms paleonyms, or old names. Terms like pharmacon, supplement, trace, hymen, gram, spacing, and incision have been used throughout philosophical history. Derrida reappropriates these terms to refer to what metaphysics could not name, the differential play that generates oppositions. These are not new concepts, but marks of something that was always there, but repressed. Deconstruction has profound implications for how we understand truth, identity, and knowledge. If meaning is always deferred and depends on absent contexts, complete knowledge becomes impossible. Truth cannot be a matter of correspondence between statements and fully present facts. Identity cannot be self-contained, but always depends on difference from what it excludes. Subjects are not present to themselves, but divided by the temporal gaps and differences within language. These conclusions challenge foundational assumptions of Western philosophy since Plato. Derrida's writing style deliberately enacts these ideas. His texts are often dense, elusive, and resistant to summary. They play with language, use puns and multiple meanings, and refuse linear argumentation. This frustrated many readers who expected philosophical clarity and rigor. Michel Foucault reportedly called Derrida's prose terrorist obscurantism. The text is written so obscurely you cannot figure out the thesis. When criticized, the response is, "You misunderstood me, you are stupid." This accusation captures real frustrations with Derrida's difficulty. But defenders argue Derrida's style serves philosophical purposes. If language necessarily involves ambiguity and multiple meanings, philosophical writing should acknowledge rather than suppress this. Traditional philosophical prose pretends to transparency it cannot actually achieve. Derrida's style makes visible the textual operations all philosophy performs, but usually hides. The difficulty forces readers to engage actively rather than consuming ideas passively. Whether this justifies the obscurity remains contested. Deconstruction spread far beyond philosophy into literary criticism, law, architecture, feminism, and post-colonial studies. In literary criticism, deconstruction showed how texts undermine their apparent meanings and contain multiple interpretive possibilities. In legal studies, it revealed how laws depend on exclusions and violence despite claiming neutrality and justice. In architecture, deconstructivism challenged functional modernism with fragmented asymmetrical designs. In feminism and post-colonial theory, deconstruction exposed how identities are constructed through binary oppositions that marginalize certain groups. The concept of othering illustrates deconstruction's political applications. Western identity constructs itself by defining non-Western cultures as its opposite. The West becomes rational, civilized, and progressive by portraying the rest as irrational, primitive, and stagnant. This binary opposition justifies colonialism and domination as civilizing missions. Deconstruction shows how Western identity depends on this constructed other. It reveals the violence involved in creating and maintaining such hierarchies. Critics raised numerous objections to deconstruction. Some argued it leads to nihilism by denying truth and objective knowledge. Others claimed it results in interpretive anarchism, where any reading becomes equally valid. Still others insisted it is self-refuting because its own arguments depend on meaning and truth it claims are impossible. Jürgen Habermas argued deconstruction commits performative contradiction by using rational argument to undermine rationality. John Searle accused Derrida of confusing use and mention, failing to grasp basic distinctions in philosophy of language. Derrida responded that deconstruction does not deny meaning or truth. It shows that meaning and truth are more complex than traditional theories acknowledge. Deconstruction does not claim all interpretations are equally valid, but shows how validity itself depends on contextual criteria. It does not reject rational argument, but questions whether rationality exhausts what thought can do. The accusation of self-refutation assumes deconstruction makes theoretical claims of the traditional sort, but deconstruction operates differently, performing rather than stating its insights. The relationship between deconstruction and ethics became important in Derrida's later work. He argued deconstruction is motivated by ethical responsibility to what cannot be contained by concepts. Justice requires attending to singularity and otherness that systems of law cannot fully capture. Hospitality demands welcoming the other without reducing them to familiar categories. Friendship involves a relationship not based on symmetry or exchange, but on asymmetry and gift. These ethical concerns show deconstruction is not merely negative critique, but opens possibilities for different ways of relating. Part 4. Foucault. Power, Knowledge, and Genealogy. Michel Foucault transformed how we understand the relationships between power, knowledge, and human subjectivity. His work spans three main periods: archaeology, genealogy, and ethics, each developing distinct methods and concerns. But throughout all periods, Foucault questioned how power operates through knowledge systems to constitute what we take as natural, normal, and true. He showed that human beings and human knowledge are thoroughly historical, rather than reflecting universal essences. Foucault's archaeological period in the 1960s analysed knowledge systems, or epistemes, that structure what can be thought in different historical periods. His book, The Order of Things, examined how sciences of life, language and wealth emerged in the classical age. Each episteme organizes knowledge through underlying rules and structures that thinkers cannot see from within their own time. These structures determine what questions can be asked, what counts as evidence, and what forms of knowledge are possible. The archaeological method maps these structures without judging whether they represent progress toward truth. History does not move linearly toward better knowledge, but shifts discontinuously between incommensurable frameworks. In The Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault refined his methodological approach. He focused on discourses as systems of statements governed by rules of formation. Discourse does not refer to language in general, but to specific practices that systematically form the objects they speak about. Medical discourse does not describe pre-existing diseases, but constitutes disease as an object of knowledge. Psychiatric discourse does not discover mental illness, but creates categories that define what counts as madness. This means power operates at the most fundamental level of knowledge formation, determining what can become an object of study. However, archaeology proved limited because it could not adequately explain historical change. It described synchronic structures within periods, but not diachronic transformations between them. This led Foucault to develop genealogy in the 1970s, drawing explicitly from Nietzsche. Genealogy studies how contingent events, strategies, and power relations converge to create new discourses and practices. It seeks the accidents and dispersions at historical beginnings rather than unified origins. Where archaeology examined what could be known, genealogy examines how power relations make certain things knowable. Foucault's genealogical masterpiece, Discipline and Punish, analysed the birth of the modern prison. The 18th century saw a transformation from spectacular public punishments to disciplinary confinement. Previously, criminals were tortured and executed in public ceremonies, demonstrating sovereign power. Modern systems punish less violently but more effectively through continuous surveillance and normalization. The prison does not simply react to crime, but produces criminals as specific types of subjects requiring perpetual monitoring. Foucault traced how disciplinary techniques from prisons spread throughout society to factories, schools, hospitals, and military barracks. The panopticon, designed by Jeremy Bentham, became Foucault's model for modern disciplinary power. This prison design places a central observation tower surrounded by cells arranged in a circle. Guards in the tower can observe any prisoner while remaining invisible themselves. Prisoners never know when they are being watched, so they must assume constant surveillance. This produces self-regulation as prisoners internalize the disciplinary gaze. They become their own guards, monitoring and correcting their own behavior according to institutional norms. Foucault argued this panoptic principle characterizes modern power relations generally. Power operates not primarily through repression, but through production of normalized subjects. Institutions do not simply forbid behaviors, but create categories of normal and abnormal persons. Schools produce good students by defining learning disabilities and behavioral disorders. Medicine produces healthy bodies by defining diseases and deviant physiologies. Psychiatry produces sane subjects by defining mental illnesses and personality disorders. Each produces knowledge that classifies, measures, and organizes populations according to norms. Power and knowledge are inseparable in these processes, forming what Foucault called power and knowledge as a hyphenated unity. This reconceptualization of power challenged traditional political theory. Political philosophy typically imagined power as repressive force held by sovereigns or states. Power prohibits actions, censors speech, and restricts freedom. Resistance meant overthrowing those who hold power and liberating repressed natural human capacities. But Foucault argued power is primarily productive rather than repressive. It produces subjects, knowledges, and realities rather than simply limiting pre-existing ones. Power does not radiate from a central source, but operates through capillary networks at micro-levels. Doctors, teachers, social workers, psychiatrists, and administrators exercise power in everyday practices. These exercises do not simply implement decisions made at higher levels. They constitute power through countless small judgments about what is normal, healthy, sane, productive, and desirable. Power circulates through social networks rather than being possessed by individuals or institutions. Everyone participates in power relations as both subject and object, both exercising and being subjected to power. Crucially, power and resistance are inseparable. Where there is power, there is always resistance, though resistance can never stand completely outside power. Resistance operates within power relations, using available discourses and practices to create counter-movements. But these counter-movements can get reincorporated into power networks, producing new forms of regulation. Gay liberation movements created new identities and communities, but also new targets for regulatory mechanisms. Feminist movements challenged patriarchy, but generated new disciplines and expert knowledges that could become normalizing. Foucault introduced the concept of biopower to analyze modern governance of populations. Beginning in the 18th century, states increasingly concerned themselves with population health, reproduction, and optimization. Biopower operates on two levels: disciplining individual bodies and regulating entire populations. At the individual level, discipline creates docile and productive subjects through training and normalization. At the population level, biopolitics manages birth rates, mortality, public health, housing, migration, and genetic quality. Life itself becomes the target and instrument of political power. The concept of governmentality extends analysis beyond the state to multiple rationalities of governance. Governmentality names the complex of institutions, procedures, analyses, and tactics that make populations governable. It includes not just formal politics, but economic management, social welfare, public health, education, and urban planning. Different rationalities of governance emerge historically, each with distinct objectives, instruments, and knowledge bases. Liberal governmentality operates through freedom rather than coercion, shaping choices by structuring possibilities. Neoliberal governmentality extends market logic to all domains of life, making individuals responsible for their own success through entrepreneurial self-management. Foucault's history of sexuality challenged conventional understandings of sexual repression. The repressive hypothesis claims that Victorian society repressed sexuality through prohibition and silence. Liberation would require overcoming repression and speaking freely about sex. But Foucault argued the opposite occurred. Since the 17th century, Western societies produced an explosion of discourse about sexuality. Confession, psychoanalysis, sexology, medicine, and education all demanded detailed knowledge of sexual desires and practices. This proliferation of sexual discourse did not liberate but produce sexuality as a domain of knowledge and power. Sexuality became the supposed secret of personal identity that must be discovered and managed. New sexual identities emerged, the homosexual, the pervert, the hysterical woman, each requiring expert knowledge and intervention. These categories did not discover pre-existing types, but created them through classificatory practices. Power operates through inciting speech about sexuality, rather than silencing it. We are made to believe that truth of ourselves lies in our sexuality, which must be endlessly examined and regulated. Foucault's genealogical approach challenged progressive narratives of history. Changes do not represent movement toward liberation or enlightenment, but shifts in power relations. Modern psychiatry did not discover the truth of mental illness, but transformed how madness was understood and managed. Modern medicine did not simply cure more diseases, but reorganized how bodies became objects of knowledge and intervention. Modern punishment did not become more humane, but developed more effective technologies of control. Each change involves losses and gains rather than simple progress. In his final works during the 1980s, Foucault turned to ethics and technologies of the self. He examined how ancient Greeks and Romans fashioned themselves as ethical subjects. This was not simply imposed by external power, but involved practices individuals performed on themselves. Diet, exercise, sexual conduct, and contemplation were techniques for creating oneself as a work of art. Foucault suggested these ancient practices offered resources for contemporary ethics not based on universal rules or normalizing knowledge. We might create ourselves through aesthetic practices of freedom rather than discovering our true nature through scientific knowledge. This late emphasis on self-fashioning and freedom seemed to contradict earlier genealogical work. If power constitutes subjects thoroughly, how can subjects resist or transform themselves? Foucault responded that subjects are never completely determined by power relations. Power relations presuppose subjects who can act, even if action always occurs within constraints. The task is not achieving liberation from all power, but perpetually transforming power relations. This requires unending critical work on our limits and possibilities. Critics challenged Foucault's analysis from multiple angles. Some argued his account of power eliminates human agency and makes resistance impossible. If power produces subjects completely, how can subjects stand against power to resist it? Others claimed Foucault covertly smuggles in normative commitments while rejecting explicit ethical frameworks. His genealogies clearly oppose certain power relations, but what grounds these critical judgments? Still, others insisted his historical accounts were inaccurate or overgeneralized from specific cases. Habermas argued Foucault committed performative contradiction by using rational argument to challenge rationality itself. Foucault employs scholarly evidence, logical reasoning, and truth claims to undermine truth and reason. His genealogies depend on historical accuracy, while arguing all knowledge serves power interests. This makes his position self-undermining and philosophically incoherent. Foucault responded that he never rejected truth or rationality entirely. He questioned specific truth regimes and forms of rationality that dominate particular historical periods. His genealogies did not claim absolute truth, but offered tools for thinking differently. The goal was not to escape power and knowledge, but to examine how specific configurations enable and constrain certain possibilities. This requires using available intellectual resources critically without claiming to stand outside history. Foucault's influence extends across numerous fields beyond philosophy. In sociology, his concepts reshaped understanding of institutions, professions, and social control. In critical criminology, his analysis transformed debates about punishment, rehabilitation, and prison reform. In cultural studies, his framework illuminated how identities get constructed through discourse and representation. In feminist theory, his insights about power and the body enabled analyses of gender normalization. In post-colonial studies, his genealogical method revealed how colonialism operated through knowledge production. In queer theory, his history of sexuality provided foundations for understanding how sexual identities emerge and get regulated. Each application adapted Foucault's concepts to new contexts and questions. Part 5. Deleuze, Difference and Productive Repetition. Gilles Deleuze developed a philosophy of difference that challenged Western metaphysics' emphasis on identity. Working initially through interpretations of Nietzsche, Bergson and Spinoza, Deleuze created a systematic alternative to dialectical and representational thinking. His project aimed to think difference positively rather than negatively, as productive force rather than mere absence of identity. This seemingly abstract concern had profound implications for understanding creativity, subjectivity, politics and life itself. Western philosophy since Plato privileged identity over difference, according to Deleuze. Thought operates by identifying what things are, classifying them under stable concepts. Difference appears only as negation of identity, what things are not. This makes difference secondary and dependent on prior identities. Hegel's dialectic exemplifies this structure even while emphasizing negativity and contradiction. The dialectic moves through oppositions contained within identity, ultimately returning difference to unity. But Deleuze argued difference is primary and productive. Things differ from themselves and from each other without reference to prior identities. Difference generates identity through processes of repetition and differentiation rather than being derived from identity. This requires thinking difference in itself, positively and affirmatively, rather than as lack or negation. Deleuze connected this to Nietzsche's concept of eternal return, understood as return of difference. The eternal return does not mean identical repetition of the same events forever. Rather, it means repetition of difference itself, where what repeats is precisely the new and different. Each moment repeats the structure of becoming without being identical to any previous moment. This affirms change, multiplicity, and creativity as fundamental features of reality. Nothing has fixed essence, but continuously differentiates itself through time. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze's major systematic work, he developed these ideas rigorously. Representational thinking depends on 4 conceptual pillars: identity, opposition, analogy, and resemblance. Concepts have identity defined through genus and species. Things relate through logical opposition within categories. Different domains connect through analogical correspondence. Individuals resemble concepts as imperfect copies. This representational quadripartite structure cannot think difference in itself, but only differences that fit within these limiting forms. Deleuze proposed thinking through intensive rather than extensive differences. Extensive differences are measurable distances between already constituted objects in space. Intensive differences are differences of degree, like temperature, pressure, or speed, that produce change. Intensive differences cannot be represented because they exist only in their effects. They do not have stable identity, but continuously vary and transform. A temperature is not a thing, but a degree of difference that makes other differences. These intensive differences Deleuze called the virtual, contrasting it with the actual. The virtual is real but not actual. It has full reality without having spatial existence or fixed form. Think of genetic potential in DNA or mathematical structures underlying physical systems. The virtual is not possible waiting to become real, but a dimension of reality that actualizes differently in different circumstances. Every actual thing has a virtual dimension, a field of potential differences that it expresses partially. The virtual is the condition for creativity and novelty in nature and thought. Deleuze completely reconceived subjectivity through this framework. The subject is not a unified consciousness or stable identity, but a multiplicity of processes. Consciousness becomes merely one faculty among others rather than the center of subjectivity. Memory, imagination, sensibility, and thought operate autonomously according to their own principles. These faculties do not harmonize naturally, but come into discord when forced beyond their limits. Thinking occurs not through voluntary reflection, but when something forces thought to encounter what it cannot think. This fracturing of the subject leads to what Deleuze called the schizophrenic subject. Schizophrenia here does not mean clinical psychosis, but a philosophical condition. The schizophrenic subject experiences intensive differences directly without organizing them into stable representations. This subject has no unified identity, but proliferates as multiple partial selves connected through flows and intensities. Deleuze suggested this captures something essential about subjectivity that representational thinking conceals. We are multiplicities before we are unities, processes before we are substances. Deleuze's collaboration with psychoanalyst Felix Guattari produced Anti-Oedipus, a radical critique of psychoanalysis and capitalism. They argued psychoanalysis reduces desire to lack and confines it within the family triangle of Oedipus. Father, mother, and child become universal structures supposedly explaining all desire. But this ignores how desire connects with social, economic, and political forces outside the family. Desire is not lack-seeking fulfillment, but productive power, creating connections, intensities, and new configurations. Psychoanalysis domesticates desire by privatizing it as personal neurosis, requiring expert interpretation. They propose schizoanalysis as an alternative that liberates desire from Oedipal representation. Schizoanalysis traces how desire flows through social machines, connecting bodies, technologies, and institutions. Every configuration of desire is a historical product rather than expression of universal structures. Different societies organize desire differently through what Deleuze and Guattari called territorial, despotic, and capitalist machines. Primitive societies territorialize desire through kinship systems inscribed directly on bodies. Scarification, initiation rites, and gift exchanges create social relations by marking flesh. The earth itself functions as the body without organs, the surface on which everything gets inscribed. These inscriptions are both brutal and creative, establishing meaning through pain and repetition. Despotic societies deterritorialize these kinship codes and reterritorialize them through the state. The emperor or ruler becomes the new body without organs, appropriating all social production. Direct relation to the earth gets mediated through bureaucratic hierarchies and written laws. The state institutes transcendent authority, supposedly standing above society while organizing it from within. Capitalism deterritorializes all previous codes by reducing everything to exchange value. Money becomes the universal equivalent, making all social relations commensurable. But capitalism also reterritorializes by creating artificial scarcities, private property, and wage labor. It constantly pushes towards its own limits by freeing flows of desire, but must contain them to maintain itself. Schizophrenia represents capitalism's absolute limit, the point where coded flows escape entirely. Revolutionary potential lies in accelerating capitalism's deterritorializing tendencies beyond the point where it can recode them. This political vision proved controversial even among leftists. Critics worried about romanticizing madness and celebrating dissolution of social bonds. Others questioned whether accelerating capitalism's destructive tendencies could lead anywhere except catastrophe. Deleuze and Guattari responded that revolutionary movements must experiment with new configurations rather than restoring previous orders or following predetermined plans. Their later work, 1,000 Plateaus, developed these ideas into a comprehensive philosophy of multiplicities. They rejected tree-like hierarchical structures in favor of rhizomatic networks. Rhizomes spread horizontally with no central root, growing through multiple connections in all directions. This models how ideas, movements, and life forms develop through lateral connections rather than vertical development. There are no origins or foundations, but only middles that extend in multiple directions. Every point potentially connects with every other point without passing through predetermined paths. They introduced concepts like assemblages, lines of flight, and bodies without organs to analyze these rhizomatic structures. Assemblages are temporary configurations bringing together heterogeneous elements in productive arrangements. A book is an assemblage of concepts, readers, historical contexts, and material technologies. A social movement is an assemblage of bodies, ideas, communication networks, and spatial configurations. Lines of flight are trajectories that escape established territories and create new possibilities. Bodies without organs are intensive fields of potentials not yet organized into functional structures. Deleuze's philosophy of cinema elaborated how thought operates through images rather than concepts alone. Cinema does not simply represent pre-existing reality, but creates new ways of thinking through movement images and time images. Classical cinema organized movement through rational cuts, following sensory-motor schemas. Modern cinema broke these schemas by presenting pure optical and sound situations that thought cannot organize through action. This forces thought to encounter time directly as difference rather than movement through space. Cinema thus becomes philosophical experimentation rather than illustration of preformed ideas. Critics accuse Deleuze of obscurantism and producing philosophy more poetic than rigorous. His proliferation of neologisms and concept metaphors seemed to resist clear argumentation. The scientific pretensions of his work, invoking mathematics, physics, and biology, struck many as superficial appropriations. Alain Socal's hoax, exposing bogus postmodern science, targeted this tendency to use scientific terminology metaphorically. Defenders argued Deleuze created concepts for thinking what traditional philosophy cannot think. His difficult style enacts the multiplicity and creativity he theorizes rather than simply describing them. The goal is not representing reality accurately, but producing concepts that make new thoughts possible. Philosophy for Deleuze is creative practice, like art, rather than discovery of pre-existing truths. Deleuze's influence extended beyond philosophy into art, architecture, geography, and political theory. Architects used his concepts to challenge functional modernism and create buildings as assemblages. Geographers employed his spatial thinking to understand cities as rhizomatic networks rather than hierarchical structures. Political theorists adapted his concepts of becoming, multiplicity, and lines of flight to theorize resistance movements. Literary scholars used his ideas about repetition and difference to read texts as productive machines rather than representations. Part 6. Baudrillard, Simulation and Hyperreality. Jean Baudrillard pushed postmodern analysis to radical extremes with concepts of simulation and hyperreality. He argued contemporary society no longer distinguishes reality from representation, original from copy, true from false. Everything becomes simulation, signs referring only to other signs without external reference. This produces a hyperreal condition where models and codes precede and generate what we experience as reality. Baudrillard identified 4 successive phases in the history of images and representation. First, images reflect basic reality as faithful copies. Second, images mask and pervert basic reality through distortion. Third, images mask the absence of basic reality by presenting themselves as if reality existed behind them. Fourth, images bear no relation to any reality whatsoever, becoming pure simulacra. Contemporary culture exists in this fourth phase, where simulation precedes and produces reality. The simulacrum is a copy without an original, a representation without a represented. Traditional philosophy privileged originals over copies, reality over appearance, truth over illusion. Plato distinguished true forms from imperfect material copies. Christianity distinguished divine truth from earthly shadows. Modernity distinguished objective reality from subjective representations, but simulation eliminates these distinctions entirely. Consider Disneyland as Baudrillard's example of how simulation operates. Disneyland presents itself as imaginary space separate from real America. But this opposition between fantasy and reality is itself simulated. Disneyland exists to make the rest of America appear real by contrast, when America itself is already hyper-real. Los Angeles and America are Disneyland in reality, all equally organized through images, codes, and models. The distinction between real and fake conceals that this distinction no longer applies. Baudrillard analyzed how media and communication technologies produce hyperreality. Mass media do not simply transmit information about reality, but generate reality through information flows. Television news does not report events, but creates events as newsworthy through selection and framing. Social media do not document lives, but construct lives as performative displays. Reality itself becomes what can be coded, transmitted, and reproduced through technological systems. The medium is not just the message, but the precondition for anything being real. Technological mediation reaches a point where it usurps the productive role formerly attributed to human subjects. Kant believed subjects synthesize sense experience through conceptual categories. Marx believed workers produce value through labor transforming nature. Freud believed the unconscious produces desires and symptoms. But Baudrillard argued these human agencies get replaced by automatic sign production. Computers generate images before we perceive them. Algorithms organize information before we encounter it. Models determine possibilities before we act. This transforms the nature of value and exchange. In Marx's analysis, commodities have use value and exchange value related through labor. But Baudrillard argued contemporary objects have only sign value operating in symbolic exchanges. Things signify social status, identity markers, and lifestyle choices rather than serving practical functions. Advertising does not inform about product qualities, but creates desires through image associations. Consumption becomes primarily consumption of signs, whose meanings circulate independently of material properties. Baudrillard distinguished symbolic exchange from economic exchange. Symbolic exchange involves gift-giving, sacrifice, and reversible relations between persons. Economic exchange involves quantified commodities circulating through impersonal markets. Traditional societies organized through symbolic exchange where objects embodied relationships. Modern capitalism reduces everything to economic exchange, where relationships become instrumentalized. But contemporary hyperreality eliminates both, replacing them with pure circulation of signs, simulating exchange. Political power itself becomes simulation, according to Baudrillard. Power no longer operates through repression, ideology or hegemony, but through production of hyperreal consensus. Opinion polls do not measure public opinion, but generate it through the polling process. Political theatre stages conflicts and choices that disguise the absence of real political alternatives. Democracy becomes a simulation of participation that legitimates decisions made through technical management. Events like elections maintain the appearance of political reality, while actual power operates elsewhere through codes and models. The collapse of the real into simulation has profound consequences, Baudrillard argued. It eliminates the very possibility of critique and resistance. Critical theory assumes it can stand outside ideology to unmask reality hidden by appearances. But if there is no reality behind appearances, if everything is already simulation, critique loses its target. The concept of alienation assumes authentic human nature that gets distorted by social structures. But if there is no authentic nature, alienation becomes meaningless. Revolution assumes the possibility of real transformation beyond current simulations. But simulation absorbs even revolution, making resistance itself another simulated image. Baudrillard proposed fatal strategies as the only possible response to hyperreality. Since direct opposition gets absorbed into simulation, resistance must push simulation beyond its limits. This means accelerating simulation until the system collapses under its own excess. It requires introducing elements that cannot be coded, exchanged, or simulated within existing systems. Death provides Baudrillard's primary example of something irreducible to simulation. Natural death, as irreversible finality, cannot be programmed or localized within symbolic systems. Graffiti artists demonstrate fatal strategies by experimenting with marks that suggest communication while blocking it. They create indeterminate signs that resist being absorbed into meaning systems. This turns indeterminacy against the system to make it malfunction rather than optimize. The point is not to convey messages, but to disrupt the circuits through which messages flow. Baudrillard's claims became increasingly extreme and provocative. He argued the Gulf War did not take place, meaning the war existed only as media spectacle. The actual conflict disappeared beneath layers of simulation for television audiences. Military operations were scripted for cameras rather than strategic objectives. This controversial claim aimed to show how even war becomes hyperreal performance. Critics accuse Baudrillard of denying real suffering and death in pursuit of theoretical shock value. Baudrillard's relationship to postmodernism itself remained ambiguous. He often declared he had nothing to do with postmodernism. This may be tactical rejection of a label that had become commodified and exchangeable for other signs. If postmodernism names a sign system, claiming nothing to do with it enacts fatal strategy of introducing non-exchangeable elements. But his concepts of simulation and hyperreality remain central to how postmodernism is understood and debated. Critics challenged Baudrillard on multiple grounds. Some argued his theory is internally contradictory, claiming truth about the impossibility of truth. If everything is simulation, this claim itself must be simulation without truth value. Others insisted he ignored material realities that resist reduction to signs. Poverty, violence, environmental destruction remain brutally real despite how they get represented. Still others saw his work as political nihilism that abandons emancipatory projects for cynical detachment. Defenders argued Baudrillard provides essential insights into contemporary media culture. His analysis illuminates how reality television, social media influencers, and deepfakes operate. Distinctions between authentic and performed identities collapse in platforms designed for self-presentation. His concepts help explain political phenomena like post-truth discourse and simulation of authenticity. Fatal strategies suggest possibilities for interventions that do not simply reinforce existing systems. Baudrillard's influence extended into cultural studies, media theory, and art. His concepts shaped analyses of consumer culture, advertising, and branding. Media theorists used his framework to examine how digital technologies transform experience and subjectivity. Artists incorporated his ideas into works exploring simulation, virtuality, and hyperreality. The film The Matrix popularized his concepts for mainstream audiences through its plot about simulated reality. But this popularization arguably turned Baudrillard's insights into exactly the kind of commodity he analyzed. Part 7. Critical Responses and Philosophical Debates. Postmodernism generated fierce controversies that continue shaping intellectual discourse. The most systematic critique came from Jürgen Habermas, who defended Enlightenment rationality against postmodern challenges. His objections established terms for ongoing debates about reason, truth, and emancipation. But numerous other critics from diverse perspectives questioned postmodern claims and methods. Habermas argued postmodernism commits performative contradiction by using rationality to attack rationality itself. Derrida employs logical argument and textual evidence while claiming texts undermine stable meanings. Foucault uses historical research and causal analysis while arguing all knowledge serves power interests. Lyotard presents reasoned arguments for why meta-narratives lost credibility. Each thinker relies on precisely what they claim to critique. This makes their positions self-refuting, according to Habermas. Furthermore, Habermas insisted postmodernists presuppose concepts they claim to undermine. Foucault's genealogies presuppose freedom and autonomy worth defending. Derrida's ethics of otherness presupposes responsibility and justice as values. Lyotard's celebration of difference presupposes that plurality is preferable to unity. But none can justify these commitments within their own frameworks. They covertly import normative standards while explicitly rejecting normative foundations. Habermas traced postmodernism to Nietzsche's rejection of reason in favor of aesthetic will to power. This makes postmodernism a continuation of aesthetic modernism rather than genuine philosophical alternative. The avant-garde art movements of modernism separated aesthetic values from scientific and moral rationality. Postmodernism illicitly applies aesthetic strategies to science and politics where they do not belong. This aestheticization of knowledge and public discourse undermines rational discussion needed for democratic legitimacy. It replaces argumentation with rhetorical performance and playful subversion. Habermas defended communicative rationality as the proper model for knowledge and politics. Communication presupposes shared norms and aims at mutual understanding through rational argument. When we make truth claims, we implicitly commit to providing reasons others can evaluate. When we make moral claims, we implicitly appeal to principles others could accept. This communicative structure provides normative foundations without requiring metaphysical absolutes. It grounds critique in practices people already engage in when they communicate seriously. Against postmodern emphasis on difference and conflict, Habermas insisted consensus remains the goal of communication. Differences can and should be resolved through rational discussion, seeking agreement. Perpetual dissensus that postmodernists celebrate undermines the possibility of coordinated social action. It makes justice impossible because justice requires shared standards for evaluating competing claims. Democratic politics requires citizens reasoning together toward common understanding rather than celebrating incommensurable language games. Habermas acknowledged modernity's failures and pathologies, but insisted the solution is completing rather than abandoning the Enlightenment project. Modern institutions contain resources for self-correction through rational critique. Science develops through testing hypotheses against evidence and revising theories accordingly. Democracy improves through expanding participation and strengthening deliberative procedures. We need more rationality, not less, to address problems like environmental destruction, inequality, and authoritarianism. Postmodern skepticism toward reason leaves us defenseless against irrationalism and domination. Postmodernists responded that Habermas misunderstood their projects. They did not reject rationality entirely, but questioned specific forms of rationality that claim universality. Deconstruction does not abandon meaning, but shows meaning is more complex than traditional theories acknowledge. Genealogy does not deny truth, but examines how truth claims function within power relations. Incredulity toward meta-narratives does not eliminate all narratives, but pluralizes them. These are critical operations internal to reason, rather than wholesale rejections of it. Furthermore, postmodernists argued Habermas's communicative rationality smuggles in substantive commitments disguised as formal procedures. His model privileges Western conversational norms as universal structures of communication. It assumes conflicts can be resolved through dialogue when some conflicts involve incommensurable frameworks. It presupposes all parties share commitment to consensus when some may value dissensus. His supposedly formal theory actually imposes particular cultural values as necessary for rationality. This exemplifies exactly the kind of concealed power postmodernism aims to expose. Analytic philosophers raise different objections focused on clarity and argumentation. John Searle accused Derrida of elementary confusions about language and meaning. Derrida allegedly conflates types and tokens, use and mention, in ways any competent philosopher should avoid. His arguments rely on ambiguities and wordplay rather than rigorous reasoning. This makes deconstruction philosophically worthless, despite generating academic industry around it. Searle suggested continental philosophy generally sacrifices clarity for obscurity and depth for obscurantism. This sparked the so-called Sakal affair, which damaged postmodernism's intellectual reputation. Physicist Alan Sakal submitted a hoax article filled with postmodern jargon and scientific nonsense to the cultural studies journal Social Text. The journal published it, apparently unable to distinguish genuine argument from parody. Sakal then revealed the hoax to demonstrate postmodernism's intellectual bankruptcy. He argued postmodernists abuse scientific concepts they do not understand for rhetorical effect. They use technical terminology metaphorically while pretending to make substantive claims about physics or mathematics. The Sakal affair revealed deep divisions about intellectual standards and disciplinary boundaries. Some saw it as devastating exposure of postmodern charlatanism. Others viewed it as cheap trick that proved nothing about postmodernism's merits. Still others argued both sides misunderstood each other's projects and methods. The controversy highlighted conflicts between scientific and humanistic cultures within academia. It raised questions about peer review, interdisciplinarity, and what counts as legitimate scholarship. Feminist scholars engaged postmodernism with both appreciation and criticism. Postmodern concepts helped feminists analyze how gender gets constructed through discourse and power relations. Deconstruction exposed binary oppositions like male-female that naturalize hierarchy and domination. Foucault's analysis of biopower illuminated how bodies become gendered through disciplinary practices. These insights proved valuable for feminist theory and politics. But some feminists worried postmodernism undermined foundations needed for feminist politics. If categories like woman and gender are purely constructed, what grounds solidarity among women? If there is no stable identity, how can groups mobilize for political change? If truth is always contingent, how can feminists claim patriarchy really exists and really harms women? These concerns led to debates between postmodern feminists and those defending more foundational approaches. Some sought middle positions, acknowledging construction while maintaining strategic essentialism for political purposes. Marxist critics argued postmodernism abandons materialist analysis and class politics. Focusing on discourse, representation and identity ignores economic structures driving inequality and exploitation. Postmodern celebration of difference fragments working class solidarity needed to challenge capitalism. Skepticism toward truth and reason disarms critique of ideology serving ruling class interests. Postmodernism reflects the experience of privileged intellectuals rather than addressing material conditions facing most people. It represents bourgeois decadence in late capitalism rather than genuinely radical thought. Some Marxists attempted synthesizing postmodern insights with historical materialism. Frederick Jameson argued postmodernism is the cultural logic of late capitalism rather than alternative to it. David Harvey connected postmodern culture to flexible accumulation regimes replacing Fordist production. These analyses treated postmodernism as symptom requiring explanation through political economy rather than philosophical position to adopt or reject. Scientists and empirically oriented scholars objected that postmodernism denies objective reality and scientific knowledge. Some postmodern claims seem to deny that electrons exist or that dinosaurs roamed Earth before humans. Social constructionism taken to extremes suggests reality is whatever we collectively decide it is. This threatens to make all beliefs equally valid regardless of evidence. It undermines education by suggesting students should not learn established knowledge, but only their own perspectives. It enables science denial about climate change, evolution, and medicine by treating scientific consensus as just one narrative among many. Defenders responded that postmodernism does not deny reality or empirical investigation. It questions how reality gets represented, categorized, and known through historically specific practices. Social constructionism about scientific concepts does not mean natural phenomena are arbitrary inventions. It means our conceptual frameworks shape what we observe and how we interpret observations. This is consistent with recognizing that some frameworks work better than others for specific purposes. Postmodernism questions naive realism and epistemic foundationalism without embracing radical skepticism or relativism. Political scientists and historians criticized postmodern approaches to their disciplines. Treating historical narratives as merely textual constructions seems to deny past events really happened. Emphasizing discontinuities and ruptures obscures genuine continuities and causal connections. Focusing on marginal phenomena and subjugated knowledges neglects major historical forces and institutions. Genealogical methods cherry-pick evidence to support predetermined conclusions rather than following historical evidence wherever it leads. These approaches sacrifice explanatory power for theoretical sophistication. Postmodern historians responded that traditional history covertly imposes present categories on the past. It assumes human nature, rationality and progress remain constant across historical contexts. This presentism prevents genuine understanding of how differently past peoples thought and lived. Genealogy does not deny causation, but examines how contingent events converge to produce outcomes that seem inevitable only retrospectively. Attending to margins and subjugated voices reveals power operations that master narratives conceal. This enriches rather than replaces other historical approaches. Religious thinkers engaged postmodernism with mixed reactions. Some welcome postmodern critiques of Enlightenment rationalism that dismissed religious belief as irrational. If reason cannot ground absolute truth claims, faith becomes intellectually respectable again. Postmodern emphasis on narrative, tradition, and community resonated with religious self-understandings. Deconstruction of Western metaphysics created space for theological alternatives to ontotheology. These possibilities made postmodernism attractive to some religious intellectuals. but others saw postmodernism as relativism incompatible with religious truth claims. If all meta-narratives lack credibility, religious narratives about creation, salvation, and ultimate meaning become merely optional stories. If truth is always contextual and contingent, revelation loses its transcendent authority. If identities are constructed rather than given, religious concepts of souls and persons become problematic. These conflicts generated debates within religious communities about engaging or rejecting postmodernism. Pragmatists like Richard Rorty found postmodernism congenial to their anti-foundationalist philosophy. Rorty interpreted postmodernists as showing we should abandon seeking metaphysical truth and ultimate foundations. Instead, we should treat beliefs as tools for coping with experience, rather than representations of reality. Different vocabularies serve different purposes without any being privileged as corresponding to how things really are. This pragmatist reading domesticated postmodernism for American audiences, but arguably missed its more radical implications. Some postmodernists rejected this interpretation as neutralizing their critical force. The debates revealed fundamental disagreements about philosophy's aims and methods. Is philosophy's goal discovering truth about reality, or creating useful concepts for thinking differently? Should philosophical arguments meet standards of clarity and logical rigor, or can they appropriately be evocative and experimental? Do philosophers speak from universal standpoint, accessible to reason, or from particular historical and cultural positions? These methodological disputes proved as significant as substantive disagreements about specific claims. They continue shaping how different philosophical traditions understand and evaluate each other. Part 8. Postmodernism across disciplines and domains. Postmodernism's influence extended far beyond philosophy into numerous academic disciplines and cultural practices. Each field adapted postmodern concepts to its specific concerns, generating new insights and controversies. Understanding these applications reveals postmodernism's broader significance for contemporary thought and culture. It also shows how ideas developed in one context get transformed when transplanted to others. Literary theory underwent transformation through postmodern and deconstructive approaches. New criticism had dominated mid-century American literary studies, focusing on texts as autonomous objects. Deconstruction challenged this by showing how texts depend on context, readers, and linguistic structures beyond authorial control. Meaning became indeterminate and plural, rather than fixed in the text waiting to be discovered. This opened literature to political readings, examining how texts construct and contest ideologies. It also generated creative critical writing that blurred boundaries between literature and criticism. Reader response criticism and reception theory emphasized how readers actively construct meanings rather than passively receiving them. Different readers and reading communities generate different valid interpretations based on their contexts and concerns. This challenged notions of correct interpretation, but raised questions about interpretive constraints. Can any reading be justified, or do texts impose limits on legitimate interpretation? These debates about interpretive freedom versus textual constraints remain unresolved. Post-colonial theory drew heavily on postmodern concepts to analyze colonial discourse and imperial power. Edward Said's Orientalism used Foucault's power-knowledge framework to examine how Western scholarship constructed the Orient as exotic other. This construction served imperial interests by representing colonized peoples as requiring Western guidance and control. Gayatri Spivak employed deconstruction to analyze how colonized subjects, especially women, get silenced within dominant discourses. Homi Bhabha developed concepts of hybridity, mimicry, and third space to theorize colonial and post-colonial identities. These approaches revealed how colonialism operated through cultural representation as much as military and economic domination. But post-colonial scholars debated postmodernism's relevance to their concerns. Some argued postmodern skepticism toward universal truth and grand narratives undermined anti-colonial critique. If meta-narratives lack credibility, what about narratives of colonial exploitation and resistance? Others worried postmodern focus on discourse and representation ignored material violence and economic extraction. Still others insisted postmodern tools effectively exposed how colonial power operated through knowledge production and cultural hegemony. These tensions generated productive debates about appropriate methods for post-colonial analysis. Architecture embraced and contested postmodernism in visible material forms. Modern architecture following Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe emphasized functional rationality, simple forms, and industrial materials. Postmodern architecture rejected this austere universalism for historical references, decorative elements, and playful irony. Robert Venturi declared less is a bore against modernist minimalism. Buildings incorporated classical columns, bright colors, and eclectic styles mixing historical periods. Las Vegas and commercial vernacular provided inspiration against highbrow modernist purity. Deconstructivist architecture pushed these ideas further by creating fragmented, unstable-looking structures. Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid, and Daniel Libeskind design buildings that appear to defy gravity and conventional geometry. These challenged assumptions that architecture must express structural logic clearly and provide stable enclosures. Critics argued such buildings sacrifice functionality for theoretical posturing and create disorienting environments. Defenders insisted they expand architectural possibilities and express contemporary experiences, complexity and contradiction. Geography and urban studies adopted postmodern spatial concepts. Edward Soja's postmodern geographies emphasized how space is socially produced rather than neutral container for activities. David Harvey analyzed how capitalism produces specific spatial forms that change with accumulation regimes. Manuel Castells examined how information technologies create network societies with new spatial logics. These approaches challenged geographic determinism while showing space matters profoundly for social relations. They revealed how power operates through spatial arrangements from architecture to global capital flows. Anthropology grappled with postmodern challenges to ethnographic authority and representation. Clifford Geertz's interpretive anthropology already emphasized how anthropologists construct, rather than discover, cultural meanings. Postmodern anthropology pushed further, questioning whether anthropologists could represent other cultures accurately at all. James Clifford and George Marcus edited Writing Culture, examining how ethnographic texts are literary constructions employing specific rhetorical strategies. This reflexive turn made anthropologists examine their own positionality, power relations with informants, and textual practices. It generated more sophisticated ethnographic writing, but also anxieties about anthropology's legitimacy and purpose. Sociology incorporated postmodern concepts while resisting complete rejection of systematic social analysis. Jean Baudrillard's sociology of simulation influenced studies of consumer culture and media societies. Zygmunt Bauman developed concepts of liquid modernity to capture contemporary social formations' fluidity and impermanence. These approaches enriched cultural sociology but faced resistance from positivist and quantitative traditions. Debates emerged about whether postmodern theory could be empirically tested or generated falsifiable predictions. Some sociologists attempted middle positions, combining postmodern insights with empirical methods. Psychology and psychoanalysis engaged postmodernism with particular intensity given their focus on subjectivity. Lacanian psychoanalysis already incorporated structuralist and post-structuralist concepts. Postmodern psychology questioned essentialist assumptions about human nature, normal development, and mental health. Social constructionist approaches examined how psychological categories get created through discourse and professional practices. Narrative therapy used postmodern ideas to help clients rewrite their life stories rather than discovering true selves. But mainstream psychology largely resisted postmodernism as incompatible with scientific methodology and therapeutic efficacy. Law and legal studies applied deconstruction to analyze how legal texts and reasoning operate. Critical legal studies movement used postmodern concepts to challenge legal formalism and objectivity claims. Legal texts contain contradictions and indeterminacies that allow multiple legitimate interpretations serving different interests. Law cannot be neutral arbiter standing above politics, but actively constructs social categories and power relations. These insights challenged traditional legal education and practice while facing resistance from legal establishment. Critics worried postmodern legal theory undermined rule of law and provided no guidance for legal decision-making. Art embraced postmodern approaches across multiple media and practices. Postmodern art rejected modernist avant-garde's search for essential artistic forms and progressive development. It employed appropriation, pastiche, irony, and mixing high and low culture. Andy Warhol's pop art anticipated postmodern aesthetics by erasing distinctions between original and copy, art and commodity. Cindy Sherman's photography explored constructed identities through self-portraits in various roles and styles. Jeff Koons celebrated kitsch and consumer culture modernism had disdained. But defining postmodern art proved difficult because it lacked unified style or program. Perhaps postmodernism in art names not a style, but an attitude toward tradition, originality, and cultural hierarchy. It questions whether art should be autonomous from everyday life or can appropriately engage mass culture. It explores how meaning gets produced through context, framing, and institutional validation rather than inherent aesthetic qualities. These explorations generated vital contemporary art while raising questions about artistic value and critical standards. Music saw postmodern developments in multiple genres. Minimalist composers like Philip Glass and Steve Reich challenged Romantic Expressionism with repetitive structures and gradual variations. John Zorn combined jazz, classical, rock and world music in radical juxtapositions, refusing generic boundaries. Hip-hop's sampling practices exemplified postmodern appropriation and intertextuality. Electronic music used technology to create sounds impossible with traditional instruments, questioning musical nature itself. These developments challenged traditional musicology and generated new critical vocabularies. Film studies analyze cinema through postmodern frameworks. Postmodern films like Blade Runner, Pulp Fiction, and The Matrix self-consciously played with generic conventions, temporal structures, and reality versus simulation. They used pastiche, nostalgia, and intertextual references that postmodern theory identified as characteristic contemporary cultural logic. Film scholars debated whether postmodern cinema represented aesthetic innovation or commercial co-optation of avant-garde techniques. They examined how films reflected and shaped postmodern experience of fragmentation, simulation, and mediation. Media studies and communication theory extensively employed postmodern concepts. Marshall McLuhan's famous claim, "The medium is the message," anticipated postmodern emphasis on mediation over content. Baudrillard's simulation theory provided frameworks for analyzing television, advertising, and digital media. Studies examined how media construct reality rather than representing pre-existing reality objectively. New media technologies like internet and social media raised urgent questions about identity, community, and knowledge in digital environments. Postmodern concepts helped theorize these transformations while themselves getting transformed by technological changes. Cultural studies emerged as an interdisciplinary field heavily influenced by postmodern approaches. It examined popular culture, mass media, consumption, and everyday life using tools from multiple disciplines. Stuart Hall's encoding and decoding model showed how audiences actively interpret media messages according to their social positions. Cultural studies analyzed how cultural forms both reinforce and resist dominant ideologies. It gave serious scholarly attention to phenomena previously dismissed as trivial or beneath academic concern. This democratization of culture generated both excitement about new research areas and anxieties about academic standards declining. Science and technology studies incorporated postmodern perspectives on scientific knowledge production. Bruno Latour's actor network theory analyzed how scientific facts get constructed through networks of human and non-human actors. Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto used postmodern concepts to rethink relationships between humans, animals, and machines. These approaches treated science as social practice shaped by cultural contexts, institutional structures, and material technologies. They challenged but did not simply reject scientific authority, seeking more sophisticated understandings of how science operates. The science wars emerged when some scientists perceived these analyses as attacks on scientific objectivity and rationality. Education faced challenges from postmodern questioning of knowledge, truth, and authority. If knowledge is socially constructed and contextual, what should schools teach as established knowledge? If texts have multiple legitimate interpretations, can teachers correct student readings as wrong? If authority is always questionable, how can educators maintain classroom order and pedagogical expertise? Some educators embraced postmodern pedagogy, emphasizing multiple perspectives, student voice, and critical questioning. Others worried this undermined education's core missions of transmitting knowledge and developing rigorous thinking. Business and management studies surprisingly adopted some postmodern concepts. Organizational theorists examined how corporate cultures get constructed through narratives, symbols, and discourses. Leadership studies explored how leaders perform authority through image management and impression control. Marketing embraced postmodern consumer culture theory, analyzing how brands construct identities and meanings. These applications often stripped away postmodernism's critical edge, using its insights to enhance corporate effectiveness. This commodification of postmodern theory troubled critics who saw it betraying radical potential for system maintenance. Part 9. Misconceptions, Limitations, and Boundary Cases. Postmodernism accumulated numerous misunderstandings that obscure its actual claims and contributions. Distinguishing genuine postmodern positions from caricatures requires careful attention to what major thinkers actually argued. Common misconceptions often result from oversimplifications, hostile readings, or applying postmodern labels too broadly. Examining these clarifies postmodernism's real commitments and their limits. The most pervasive misconception is that postmodernism denies reality exists. Critics often claim postmodernists believe physical world is merely mental construction or linguistic invention. But no major postmodern thinker makes this crude idealist claim. Derrida's statement that there is no outside text does not mean reality does not exist. It means we access reality through interpretive frameworks and representations rather than immediately and transparently. Foucault analyzed how discourses constitute objects of knowledge, not how discourse creates material reality from nothing. The constructionist claim is epistemological and historical rather than metaphysical. It concerns how we know and categorize reality, rather than whether reality exists independently of us. Natural kinds, like electrons and dinosaurs, existed before humans named them. But how we conceptualize, measure, and explain them depends on historically specific scientific frameworks. These frameworks shape what observations count as relevant and how evidence gets interpreted. Recognizing this constructed dimension of knowledge does not make all beliefs equally arbitrary or deny some correspond better to reality than others. Another misconception is that postmodernism embraces simple relativism, where all views are equally true. Critics worry postmodernism makes truth purely subjective or merely matter of power. If truth is contextual and constructed, does that mean Nazi claims about Jews are just as valid as anti-Nazi claims? This caricature misses how postmodernists actually address truth and justification. Postmodern thinkers distinguish between absolute universal truth, independent of context, and pragmatic truth, adequate for specific purposes. Rejecting the former does not require accepting that anything goes. Different knowledge claims can be evaluated according to contextual standards like empirical evidence, logical consistency, explanatory power, and practical consequences. These standards themselves have histories and can be criticized, but are not arbitrary or merely reflect power. Saying truth is constructed does not mean it can be constructed however anyone wants. Construction follows rules, uses materials, and faces constraints that differentiate better from worse constructions. The relativism charge also confuses descriptive claims about diversity with normative claims endorsing indifference. Postmodernists describe how different cultures and periods have different truth standards and knowledge systems. This descriptive pluralism does not require normative relativism, that all standards are equally good. One can acknowledge diversity while still making judgments about which frameworks work better for specific purposes. Recognizing European colonialism imposed particular knowledge systems does not mean indigenous and European knowledge are simply incommensurable or equally valid for every purpose. It means examining what each enables and forecloses rather than assuming universal hierarchy. Many critics claim postmodernism is politically nihilistic or apathetic. If there is no truth or foundation for values, why struggle for justice or resist oppression? This criticism ignores how postmodern thinkers were deeply engaged in political activism and ethical concerns. Foucault participated in prison reform movements and gay rights advocacy. Derrida wrote extensively on justice, hospitality, and responsibility to others. Lyotard developed ethics of attending to differences and incommensurable claims. Postmodern politics rejects foundationalist justifications, but not political engagement itself. One can oppose oppression without claiming to know absolute moral truth or historical necessity. One can pursue justice while acknowledging justice remains always contested and incomplete. Indeed, postmodernists argue that recognizing contingency in construction makes politics more urgent rather than less. If social arrangements are not natural or necessary, they can and should be challenged and transformed. Political struggle does not require metaphysical certainty, but commitment to specific values and visions. Some portray postmodernism as advocating intellectual anarchy, rejecting all standards and methods. This caricature suggests postmodern scholars produce arbitrary interpretations without discipline or rigor. But postmodern works typically display extensive scholarship, careful reading, and systematic analysis. Derrida's texts involve meticulous attention to philosophical and literary traditions. Foucault's genealogies rest on detailed archival research and historical documentation. Rejecting foundationalist epistemology does not mean abandoning scholarly rigor or interpretive responsibility. The charge of obscurantism and deliberate obfuscation is partially justified, but requires nuance. Postmodern texts are often genuinely difficult and resist easy summary. This partly reflects complex ideas that cannot be expressed in simple language without distortion. It also reflects philosophical traditions with their own vocabularies and reference points unfamiliar to Anglophone readers. Translation across languages and intellectual cultures adds further difficulties. but some obscurity may be unnecessary, and some postmodern imitators cultivate difficulty as marker of theoretical sophistication. The question of where postmodernism's boundaries lie proves surprisingly difficult. Is postmodernism a historical period, philosophical movement, cultural condition, or all three? Different theorists use the term differently, creating confusion about who counts as postmodern. Heidegger influenced postmodernism, but predates the term and might be considered late modern rather than postmodern. Nietzsche wrote a century before postmodernism, but gets claimed as proto-postmodern. Pragmatists like Rorty share some postmodern commitments, but reject the label. Whether postmodernism names something genuinely new or merely intensifies tendencies within modernity remains contested. Lyotard suggested postmodern is the modern in its nascent state rather than temporal successor. Habermas argued postmodernism is aesthetic. Modernism illicitly extended to other domains. Some see postmodernity as distinct historical period beginning after World War II. Others view it as cultural dominant within late capitalism rather than new epoch. Still others treat postmodern as attitude or sensibility that can appear in any period. The relationship between postmodernism and post-structuralism requires clarification. These terms often get used interchangeably, especially regarding French theory from the 1960s and 70s. Post-structuralism more specifically names methods and concepts developed beyond or against structuralism. Postmodernism more broadly encompasses cultural, artistic and architectural developments alongside philosophical work. Most post-structuralists qualify as postmodernists, but postmodernism extends beyond academic philosophy to include cultural production. The overlap is substantial but not complete. Postmodernism's relationship to modernism itself remains complex and paradoxical. Postmodernism does not simply reject modernism, but has ambivalent relationship involving both critique and continuation. It rejects modernist faith in progress, rationality and universal truth, but it uses modernist critical methods to question these commitments. It challenges modernist formal innovations, but depends on modernism having already broken with tradition. This makes postmodernism simultaneously anti-modern and hypermodern, against modernity and its fulfillment. Certain scientific developments raise questions about postmodernism's adequacy. Quantum mechanics reveals how observation affects what is observed, suggesting knowledge and reality are not simply separate. Chaos theory shows how deterministic systems produce unpredictable behaviors, challenging linear causation. Neuroscience examines how brains construct perceptual reality rather than passively recording it. These developments seem to support postmodern claims about constructed nature of knowledge, but they also demonstrate science's capacity for self-correction and progressive understanding that postmodernism supposedly undermines. Cognitive science poses particular challenges for postmodern accounts of subjectivity. Research reveals universal cognitive structures and biases shaping how humans process information. Evolutionary psychology suggests human nature has biological foundations, constraining cultural variation. These findings seem to support universalist claims. Postmodernism rejects. But postmodernists might respond that neuroscience itself operates through historically specific frameworks and technological mediations. The debate concerns whether natural sciences discover mind-independent facts or construct objects through theory-laden observation. Digital technologies and artificial intelligence present new test cases for postmodern analysis. Virtual reality creates simulated environments that Baudrillard's hyperreality concepts seem to anticipate. Social media construct identity performances that postmodern theories of self as constructed illuminate. Algorithms organize information and shape experience in ways that raise questions about agency and subjectivity. These developments make postmodern concepts seem prescient and relevant, but they also challenge whether postmodern frameworks adequately address computational and networked forms of power. Environmental crisis raises questions about postmodernism's relationship to nature and matter. Climate change requires accepting objective facts about atmospheric carbon and temperature trends. Denying these realities has catastrophic consequences regardless of how they get represented. This seems to demand exactly the kind of universal truth claims postmodernism questions. But postmodernists might argue their critique targets dogmatic scientism rather than scientific findings themselves. The challenge is articulating environmental ethics and politics without foundationalist metaphysics or naive realism. Global capitalism's development since postmodernism emerged complicates assessment of its analyses. Neoliberalism's spread seems to vindicate postmodern critiques of grand narratives being replaced by market logic. But capitalism's homogenizing force contradicts postmodern emphasis on plurality and difference. Economic globalization concentrates power even as cultural production fragments. This suggests postmodern cultural analysis may miss economic determinants of contemporary conditions. Whether postmodernism adequately theorizes capitalism remains vigorously debated. Part 10. Legacy, Contemporary Relevance and Future Trajectories. Postmodernism's influence persists decades after its emergence, even as the term itself becomes contested and unfashionable. Its concepts permeate academic discourse across disciplines, whether explicitly acknowledged or absorbed into common sense. Understanding this legacy requires assessing both what postmodernism achieved and what limitations it revealed. It also demands examining how contemporary developments connect to or diverge from postmodern trajectories. Postmodernism fundamentally transformed how humanities and social sciences understand their objects and methods. Few scholars today believe they access reality immediately without mediation through language, culture, and power. Awareness that categories like gender, race, sexuality, and disability are constructed rather than natural now seems obvious. Recognition that knowledge claims always come from particular positions rather than neutral standpoints is widespread. These insights originated or were popularized through postmodern work. They now structure debates even among scholars who reject postmodernism's more radical claims. The concept of reflexivity became central to research across fields. Scholars examine their own assumptions, methods, and positions rather than claiming transparent objectivity. Anthropologists acknowledge how their presence affects communities they study and how their texts construct rather than simply describe cultures. historians recognize they write from present concerns that shape which pasts they reconstruct and how. This reflexive turn emerged directly from postmodern challenges to authoritative knowledge claims. It improved scholarly practice even when researchers disagree with postmodern epistemology. Critical attention to discourse, representation, and power became standard analytical tools. Researchers examine how language constructs social realities rather than transparently representing them. They analyze how categories get naturalized to conceal their historical construction and political functions. They investigate whose voices get heard and whose get marginalized within dominant discourses. These approaches owe substantial debts to Foucault's genealogy and Derrida's deconstruction. They enable critical insights that purely empirical or rationalist methods might miss. Identity politics and intersectionality draw on postmodern concepts while sometimes rejecting the label. Recognizing identities as constructed and performed rather than essential enables challenging their oppressive deployments. Understanding how multiple identity categories intersect to produce specific experiences of privilege and oppression requires analyzing complex power relations. These political and analytical developments extend postmodern insights about subjectivity and power. But tensions persist about whether constructed identities can ground solidarities needed for collective action. Strategic essentialism attempts middle positions that postmodernism's influence made necessary to articulate. Cultural studies legitimated serious scholarly attention to popular culture, media, and everyday life. Television, advertising, fashion, sports, and digital media became proper objects of academic research. This expansion of legitimate topics democratized academic concerns and connected scholarship to lived experience. It also raised continuing debates about academic standards and whether everything deserves scholarly analysis. The boundary between high and low culture that modernism policed largely dissolved under postmodern pressure. Whether this represents liberation from elitism or degradation of cultural standards remains contested. Interdisciplinarity became more accepted and practiced partly through postmodern influence. Traditional disciplinary boundaries seemed arbitrary and limiting rather than natural and necessary. Problems like climate change, inequality, and technological transformation require multiple disciplinary perspectives. New hybrid fields emerge combining methods and concepts from previously separate domains. This broke down some academic silos, but created challenges for evaluation, hiring, and training. Questions persist about whether interdisciplinarity produces genuine integration or merely juxtaposes different approaches. Contemporary political phenomena seem to vindicate some postmodern analyses while challenging others. Post-truth politics, where emotional appeals outweigh factual accuracy, resembles postmodern skepticism toward objective truth. Political leaders create alternative realities through social media and partisan media channels. Disinformation campaigns exploit digital technologies to undermine shared reality. These developments seem to realize Baudrillard's simulation society or Lyotard's collapse of meta-narratives. But they also show dangers postmodernists may have underestimated in questioning truth and objectivity. The rise of populist and authoritarian movements globally challenges postmodern political assumptions. These movements reject pluralism and difference in favor of unified national identities and strong leaders. They appeal to grand narratives about national greatness, racial purity, or religious tradition. This suggests reports of meta-narrative's death were premature. It raises questions about whether postmodern fragmentation contributed to authoritarian reactions by undermining liberal democratic legitimacy. Alternatively, these movements might represent desperate attempts to restore certainties that postmodern conditions make impossible. Digital technologies and social media transformed how postmodern concerns about identity, reality, and power manifest. Online personas demonstrate performative construction of identity that postmodern theory described. Deep fakes and image manipulation realize hyperreality, where originals and copies become indistinguishable. Algorithmic curation creates filter bubbles where different users inhabit different informational realities. Platform capitalism concentrates power through networks' effects while appearing to democratize communication. These phenomena require extending postmodern analysis to computational and algorithmic forms postmodernists did not anticipate. New materialisms emerged partly in response to postmodernism's perceived overemphasis on discourse and representation. Scholars argue that matter, bodies, and non-human actors have agency irreducible to human meanings and power relations. Climate change, pandemics, and ecological destruction demand attention to material realities that resist social construction. This does not simply return to naive realism, but seeks to theorize matter's activity without reducing it to passive stuff. New materialists often claim to correct postmodern linguistic idealism while retaining its critical insights. Whether this represents genuine advance or misunderstands postmodern positions remains debated. Object-oriented ontology and speculative realism explicitly reject postmodern correlationism. They argue philosophy since Kant wrongly assumes reality only exists in relation to human minds or language. Instead, objects exist independently and have relations among themselves without human mediation. This attempts to overcome anthropocentrism and think reality in itself rather than reality for us. Critics respond that accessing reality independent of thought and language remains impossible despite metaphysical claims otherwise. These debates continue philosophical problems postmodernism raised without providing definitive resolutions. Posthumanism extends postmodern decentering of the human subject in new directions. Rather than simply destabilizing humanist subject, posthumanism explores human entanglements with technologies, animals, and ecosystems. Artificial intelligence raises questions about whether intelligence requires consciousness or human form. Biotechnology enables genetic modifications, blurring boundaries between natural and artificial, human and non-human. Climate change reveals how human activity affects planetary systems in ways that threaten human survival. These developments require rethinking human exceptionalism while avoiding relativism that equates all entities indiscriminately. Affect theory emerged partly to address limitations in postmodern emphasis on language and representation. Affects name bodily intensities and emotional forces not fully captured by discourse analysis. They operate below or beyond conscious awareness and cannot be reduced to constructed meanings. This turn to effect seeks to theorize dimensions of experience that postmodern approaches allegedly neglected. Whether affect theory genuinely transcends postmodernism or extends its insights remains unclear. The relationship involves both continuity and correction, rather than simple rejection or acceptance. Metamodernism names a cultural sensibility oscillating between modern sincerity and postmodern irony. It acknowledges both earnest commitment to values and awareness that all values are constructed and contingent. This structure of informed naivety or pragmatic idealism attempts to move beyond postmodern cynicism without returning to naive modernism. Whether metamodernism represents genuine synthesis or merely describes contradictions remains questionable. The term captures widespread feeling that pure postmodern skepticism proves unsatisfying, even if return to pre-postmodern certainty seems impossible. This unresolved tension may characterize our current moment more accurately than any resolution. In physics, debates about quantum mechanics interpretation connect to postmodern themes. Some interpretations suggest observation creates reality rather than discovering pre-existing facts. Others maintain objective reality independent of measurement but admit its nature differs radically from classical assumptions. These discussions show how fundamental questions about reality and knowledge remain open in natural sciences. Postmodern claims about constructed nature of knowledge find both support and challenge in these developments. The relationship between philosophical postmodernism and scientific practice requires more careful analysis than either advocates or critics typically provide. Neuroscience research on consciousness raises questions about postmodern accounts of subjectivity. Brain imaging reveals neural correlates of mental states, suggesting consciousness has biological basis. Studies show how cognitive biases and heuristics shape perception and judgment in universal ways. This seems to support naturalistic explanations of mind incompatible with radical constructionism. But neuroscientists themselves debate whether brain activity explains or merely correlates with conscious experience. The hard problem of consciousness, why neural activity produces subjective experience, remains unsolved. Postmodernism's relationship to truth becomes especially urgent in contexts of denialism and conspiracy theories. Climate change denial uses postmodern-sounding arguments that scientific consensus merely reflects power rather than evidence. Anti-vaccination movements claim medical establishment constructs diseases and treatments for profit rather than health. These appropriations of postmodern rhetoric serve reactionary purposes postmodernists opposed. This creates dilemmas about defending scientific authority without returning to dogmatic scientism. It requires distinguishing legitimate critique of knowledge production from cynical exploitation of skepticism. The academy itself changed substantially due to postmodernism's influence. Hiring and curriculum reflect greater attention to diversity, marginalized voices, and global perspectives. Critical approaches previously dismissed as political or unrigorous gained legitimacy and institutional support. Interdisciplinary programs proliferated alongside traditional departments. These changes democratized academic culture but generated backlash about declining standards and political correctness. Current culture wars about universities involve conflicts postmodernism helped precipitate. Looking forward, several trajectories seem possible for postmodern legacies. One involves integration, where postmodern insights get absorbed into mainstream thought, while radical edge gets dulled. Another involves rejection, where reaction against perceived excesses leads to renewed foundationalism. A third involves transformation, where new movements address postmodern limitations while retaining critical tools. Most likely, all three occur simultaneously in different contexts and disciplines. No single narrative captures how diverse intellectual traditions engage and move beyond postmodernism. Climate emergency and ecological crisis demand responses postmodernism may be ill-equipped to provide. These require accepting objective facts about planetary systems and limits. They need coordinated global action based on shared understanding of threats and solutions. Radical relativism or skepticism about truth seems unhelpful, if not actively harmful, in this context. But postmodern analysis of power, discourse and resistance remains relevant for understanding why action proves difficult despite scientific consensus. The challenge is retaining postmodern critical tools while acknowledging realities that transcend social construction. Artificial intelligence and algorithmic governance raise new questions about agency, power, and knowledge. Machine learning systems make consequential decisions using processes humans cannot fully understand or audit. Automated systems reproduce and amplify biases from training data while appearing objective and neutral. Platform architectures structure social interactions in ways that serve corporate interests while claiming to facilitate free communication. Analyzing these requires extending postmodern concepts of power and knowledge to computational systems. It also demands technical expertise postmodern humanists typically lack. Potential synthesis between postmodern insights and scientific realism remains an open possibility. Critical realism attempts to acknowledge social construction while maintaining objective reality and causal explanation. Pragmatist approaches treat truth as what works for specific purposes without requiring correspondence to independent reality. These middle positions try to avoid both naive realism and radical constructionism. Whether they succeed or merely paper over genuine conflicts depends on one's philosophical commitments. The debates continue without consensus emerging. Postmodernism's greatest contribution may be permanently unsettling certainties rather than establishing new truths. It made thinking more self-conscious about its assumptions, limits, and political implications. It expanded what counts as legitimate knowledge and who can produce it. It revealed how power operates through knowledge production and cultural representation. These remain valuable even if specific postmodern claims prove limited or problematic. Critical questioning it exemplifies continues as necessary intellectual practice. The term postmodernism itself may have exhausted its usefulness. It accumulated too many contradictory meanings and associations to remain analytically precise. Specific concepts like deconstruction, genealogy, and simulation retain value even if postmodern label gets abandoned. New vocabularies will emerge to address problems postmodernism identified but could not fully resolve. This represents intellectual progress rather than failure, if future thought learns from postmodern insights while transcending their limitations. The conversation postmodernism began about knowledge, power, truth, and identity continues under different names and in transformed contexts.